I stood at my parents' dinner table with a champagne glass in my hand, watching my mother beam at my sister Claire. Everyone around the table was cheering for her promotion. She had just become the youngest director at her law firm, and the room felt electric with pride. My parents had organized this dinner specifically to celebrate her achievement, reserving the best restaurant downtown and inviting family friends who all gathered to toast her success. When there was a pause in the celebration, I took a breath and decided to share my news. I had been accepted into a prestigious teaching fellowship in France, something I had been working toward for 3 years. It was my moment. I raised my glass slightly and began. Actually, I have some news too. I got the, "That's nice, dear," my mother interrupted, barely looking at me. She turned immediately back to Claire. "But did you hear? Claire just became the youngest director in her entire firm. That's real success." The table erupted in laughter. People reached over to pat Claire on the back again. My glass felt heavy in my hand. I set it down slowly, the champagne suddenly tasting bitter. Then my father turned to me with a smirk that I would never forget. He leaned back in his chair and said the words that would change everything. "You've always been our consolation prize, Ellie." The room went silent for just a moment. Then someone laughed nervously as if it was a joke. But I could see in my father's eyes that he meant it. I whispered something under my breath about regretting those words, and then I got up from the table and walked out. Behind me, I could hear Claire calling my name, but I didn't turn around. My name is Ellie Moore, and I have been the other daughter my entire life. Let me explain what that means. Growing up, it meant that Claire's trophies filled the glass cabinet in our living room. First place ribbons from gymnastics, debate team awards, spelling bee certificates, all displayed where everyone who visited our house could see them. My achievements, whatever they were, gathered dust in a box at the back of my closet. I thought as a child that love was something you had to earn by being perfect. It was a prize given to the daughter who achieved the most, who impressed people the most, who made your parents proudest. I believed this so completely that I didn't even realize it was wrong. I thought maybe I just wasn't special enough. Maybe I didn't have what Claire had. I didn't understand that my parents were choosing to love her more, not because she was inherently better, but because something in them preferred her. Looking back now, I can see the pattern clearly. But as a child, I just thought I was missing something. I tried harder in school. I took piano lessons, then violin. I joined clubs and sports teams. Nothing ever seemed to be enough to shift the balance. Claire's ordinary accomplishments were treated as extraordinary. My extraordinary accomplishments were treated as ordinary, or worse, as if they didn't exist at all. "That's wonderful, Ellie," my mother would say if I told her about something I had done. And then she would add, almost automatically, "But wait until you hear what Claire did." It became the rhythm of our household. It became the soundtrack to my childhood. I remember my 25th birthday clearly. I came home from work that day expecting my parents to have planned something special. Maybe dinner at a nice restaurant, or even just a cake and candles at home with the family. I opened the front door and immediately saw the balloons. Pink and purple balloons tied to the backs of chairs, scattered around the living room. My heart jumped with excitement. But then I read the words printed on them. "Congratulations, Claire." My excitement died. I walked through the house like a ghost, looking for some sign that my parents had also prepared something for me. Maybe my balloons were in another room. Maybe they had planned a surprise. I found my mother in the kitchen, standing at the counter arranging food on a platter. She turned and smiled at me, but I could see in her eyes that she had forgotten. Actually, no, she hadn't forgotten. She had just prioritized. "Oh, honey," she said brightly. "Your birthday. We'll celebrate yours next weekend. Claire's promotion is today, so we're making it special for her." I asked, "What was this about then?" "I thought these balloons were for me." She looked confused for a moment. Then she said, "No, sweetie. These are for Claire. We already have her party planned. We'll do something for you soon, I promise." They never did anything for me. Next weekend came and went. The following weekend too. My birthday passed by like any other day. I went to work, came home, and nobody mentioned it. I made myself a cake that night and sat alone at the kitchen table, eating it with a fork directly from the pan while I watched television. I didn't blow out candles. There was no one there to sing to me. 2 months after my birthday, something happened that changed everything for me. I got a phone call from the director of a prestigious teaching fellowship program. She told me that I had been selected from hundreds of applicants to participate in their program abroad. It was a dream I had been working toward since I was in college. The fellowship would take me to France for a year, where I would teach English literature to students and have the opportunity to write and pursue my own academic interests. I was thrilled. This was something I had earned through my own work, my own effort, my own talent. No one had helped me get this position. I had written the application myself, gathered my own references, and prepared my own portfolio. It was mine. That evening, I came home and told my family the news at dinner. I thought they would be proud of me. I thought this might finally be the moment when they saw that I was capable of something meaningful. I waited until everyone was seated, and then I shared the news. I got the teaching fellowship, I said. In France. I'll be leaving in the fall. My mother looked up from her plate and laughed. That's cute, she said. But are you sure you can manage on your own? Paris is a big city, Ellie. You've never really lived independently before. My father chimed in before I could respond. Teaching isn't a real career anyway, he said. It's nice that you got accepted, I suppose, but when are you going to do something that matters? Something with actual earning potential. Claire smiled at me with what looked like pity. It was worse than any mean comment. That pity told me that she agreed with them, that she thought I was making a mistake, that she didn't believe in me either. I felt the familiar sensation of becoming invisible, of being seen as less than, of being the consolation prize all over again. 3 weeks later, my parents called a family meeting. They said they had important news to discuss, something about planning for the future. I assumed we would be talking about retirement plans or maybe house renovations. I had no idea what was actually coming. We sat in the living room, and my father pulled out a thick folder filled with documents. He began explaining how they were dividing their assets, planning for their estates, and organizing financial matters. It was boring at first, a lot of talk about investments in property and insurance policies. Then he got to the part about inheritance. We've decided, he said slowly, to divide our assets between ourselves and Claire. This ensures that everything is organized and protected. I sat there waiting for him to continue, waiting for him to mention me. But he didn't. The minutes stretched on. He talked about amounts and percentages and trust funds. All for Claire. My name never came up once. Finally I asked, what about me? Where do I fit into this plan? My father looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sadness? Resignation? He said simply, you'll understand someday, Ellie. The silence that followed felt like a verdict. It felt like a decision had been made about my worth, about my place in this family, and that I had failed to meet some standard I didn't even know existed. I realized at that moment that this wasn't about money. It was about belonging. They had decided that I didn't belong in the same category as Claire. I was expendable in a way that she wasn't. I made a decision that night. I couldn't stay in this house anymore. I couldn't keep waking up every day and trying to earn love from people who had already decided I didn't deserve it. I packed my bags carefully, not in anger but with a strange kind of calm. I put my important documents in a box, my clothes in a suitcase, and my books in another bag. I was loading everything into my car when Claire found me in the driveway. She had come outside quietly, and I didn't notice her until she spoke. Where are you going? She asked, and there was genuine sadness in her voice. Away, I said simply. I can't do this anymore. She came closer to me, and I could see that her eyes were red. They just expect more from you, she said quietly. That's all it is. They push you harder because they think you can handle it. I looked at her, really looked at her and asked, or do they expect less from me because they don't think I'm worth the effort? She couldn't meet my eyes. She turned away and went back inside. I finished loading my car, looked at the house one last time, and drove away without looking back. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. 6 weeks later, my grandmother passed away. She had been sick for a long time, and while I wasn't surprised, I was heartbroken. She had always been kinder to me than my parents were, always asked about my achievements, always listened when I needed to talk. At her funeral, I sat in the front row, but my mind kept drifting to her house. I needed to go there and help sort through her things. It was a task I couldn't imagine any of my family members wanting to do. A week after the funeral, I went to her house alone. It was a small cozy place filled with memories. Her reading chair sat by the window where she used to read mystery novels. Her kitchen still smelled like the lavender soap she always used. Walking through those rooms, I felt closer to her than I had felt in a long time. In her bedroom, I found her old wooden sewing box. It was kept on the top shelf of her closet, and I had to stand on tiptoes to reach it. Inside were needles and thread and buttons just as I expected. But tucked beneath a layer of quilting fabric was a sealed envelope. My hands began to shake as I pulled it out. Written on the front in my grandmother's careful handwriting were the words, "For Eleanor, when she's ready." Eleanor was my full name. My grandmother had never called me that except in serious moments. I opened the envelope slowly, carefully, as if it might break. Inside the envelope were documents I had never seen before. Adoption papers. My adoption papers. The names of my parents were printed on them as the adoptive parents, and my name was listed as Eleanor Margaret Moore. I read the date on the papers. June 15th, exactly 6 months after Claire was born. Attached to the papers was a handwritten note in my grandmother's shaky handwriting. She had written, "You were meant to be loved, not compared. I wanted you to know the truth." My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the papers. I sat down on the edge of my grandmother's bed and read them over and over again, as if the words might change. But they didn't. I was adopted. I was brought into this family after Claire was born. I was not biologically related to these people who I had always thought were my parents. I collapsed to the floor right there in her bedroom, leaning against the bed, holding these papers to my chest. Everything made sense now. Every comment, every comparison, every moment of being less than. I wasn't their biological daughter. I was something else. Something less. And they had never told me. I sat there for hours, I think. Time didn't feel real. The afternoon light moved across the floor. Eventually, I gathered up all the papers, put them carefully back in the envelope, and left my grandmother's house. I drove to a small park and sat in my car, holding these papers and trying to understand what they meant about who I was. Over the next few days, I started connecting dots that suddenly made terrible sense. I remembered overhearing a conversation when I was about 8 years old. I had been playing in the hallway outside my parents' bedroom, and I heard my mother crying. She was saying something to my father about the baby, and about what could have been. At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. I thought maybe she was talking about Claire's friend who had gotten sick. But now I know. Claire had a twin who had died in infancy. I had vague memories of overhearing hushed conversations about this when I was very young, but I had never understood it clearly. I had never connected it to myself. I wasn't just adopted. I was adopted as a replacement for the daughter they had lost. They had brought me into their family not because they wanted me, but because they wanted to fill the empty space left by Claire's twin. I was a substitute, a second choice, a consolation prize just like my father had said. And Claire had lived her entire life as the surviving twin. She was the daughter they still had. She was the one they wanted. And I was the one they had to bring in to make themselves feel better about the loss. Every moment of comparison, every time they chose her over me, it all made sense now. They were not comparing me to Claire because they thought I could do better. They were comparing me to Claire because I was never supposed to be there in the first place. I called in sick to work for a week. I couldn't function. I couldn't pretend that everything was normal when my entire understanding of my identity had shattered. I confronted my mother a week later. I drove to the house where I grew up, something I thought I would never do again. My father was at work, but my mother was home. I showed her the adoption papers and watched her face drain of all color. She looked like someone who had been caught doing something terrible. "We didn't want you to feel different," she said, her voice small and defensive. "You were a blessing after our loss. We love you." "No," I said quietly. "You don't. You love Claire. I was a substitute. You brought me in to replace her twin because you couldn't handle the loss. And then you spent my entire life treating me like I wasn't good enough compared to her." She tried to deny it, but she couldn't. She just kept repeating that they did love me, but her words felt hollow. They had had years to tell me the truth. They had chosen not to. They had chosen to let me believe that I was somehow deficient, somehow not measuring up to some standard I could never meet. When really I was never supposed to be there at all. I left the house without letting her hug me. I didn't say goodbye. I just walked out and closed the door behind me. Claire came to see me that night at the apartment I had been renting. She let herself in using the key I had given her months ago, before everything fell apart. Her eyes were red from crying, and she looked like she hadn't slept. "I need to tell you something," she said before I could even say hello. I knew. I always knew. My heart sank. "Knew what?" "That you were adopted," she said. Through her tears she confessed everything. "They told me when I was young. They said it was a secret, something I shouldn't tell you. They said you would be confused if you found out. They said they were protecting you. But you let them lie to me," I said. "For my entire life, you let them treat me like I was less than you, and you never said anything." "I wanted to tell you," she said desperately. "I really did. But they kept saying that when you were older they would tell you themselves. And then years went by and it became this huge secret. They told me you deserved to know, but they were afraid you'd leave if you found out. They were afraid they'd lose you." I realized then that even Claire's loyalty to me had been built on lies. Even my relationship with her was tainted by the deception of our parents. I couldn't look at her in the same way. I couldn't trust her in the same way. That night alone, I remembered something I had tried to forget for years. I was 6 years old, playing quietly in the living room while my parents thought I was asleep. My mother came into the room, and I could see that she had been crying. She sat down on the couch and looked at a photo album. In the album were pictures of Claire as a newborn, and pictures of another baby that looked almost exactly like her. My mother touched the photo of the other baby and said to no one in particular, "She would have been so beautiful. She would have been so smart." And then she added the words that I now understood. "She'll never be her." I thought at the time that my mother was talking about my report card or my school picture. I thought she meant I would never achieve what Claire achieved. But now I understand. She meant I would never be the daughter she lost. I would never be Claire's twin. I was not and could never be the replacement they wanted. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the dark of my apartment, remembering every moment of my life through this new lens. Every comment took on a new meaning. Every moment of being passed over suddenly made sense. I had been fighting my entire life against a competition I didn't even know I was in. The anger came in waves. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the ways I had been hurt, all the ways I had been made to feel small and worthless. One night, I went through my apartment and found the family photos I had kept. There was one from Claire's high school graduation. A family portrait where we were all dressed up and smiling as if everything was perfect. I stood there looking at that photo for a long time. Then I took it down from the wall and carried it into my kitchen. I held it over the sink and lit the corner on fire with a lighter. I watched the flames consume the happy faces, the false smiles, the lie of our perfect family. As I watched it burn, I whispered to the photo, "You'll remember this face when the world knows. You'll remember what you did to me when everyone else does too." It was a promise I made to myself that night. I was going to tell my story. I was going to make sure that no one else had to feel the way I felt, unworthy and invisible and less than. I was going to expose the truth about what my family had done to me, and I was going to do it in a way that they couldn't ignore or deny. After that night, I threw myself into writing. I started journaling every memory I had about my childhood, every moment of comparison and favoritism. I wrote about the birthday that went uncelebrated, the inheritance meeting where I wasn't included, the dinner where I was called a consolation prize. I wrote about the pain of believing that I was somehow deficient. My pain became paragraphs. My paragraphs became chapters. I started organizing my writing into a narrative, structuring it so that someone reading it could understand not just what happened to me, but what it felt like to live through it. I wrote about the psychology of being the replacement child, about the damage that favoritism does to a family. I wrote about Claire and how complicated my feelings were toward her. I wrote about my grandmother and how grateful I was for her kindness. I wrote about my parents and tried to understand their motives while still holding them accountable for their actions. The writing became therapeutic. It became a way of processing everything I had learned about myself and my family. Every day I would sit at my computer and write for hours. I wrote in coffee shops and parks and in my apartment late at night. I filled notebook after notebook with words. Friends asked me what I was working on, and I told them I was writing my story. I wasn't sure yet what I would do with it, but I knew that the act of writing it was important. In the fall, I accepted the teaching fellowship in France and moved to Paris. My first night there, I stood on the balcony of my small apartment and watched the Eiffel Tower glitter in the darkness. The city lights reflected off the Seine River, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt free. I felt like I could breathe. Paris was a place where no one knew me. No one knew my family or my history or my pain. I could be anyone I wanted to be. I could reinvent myself without the weight of being the consolation prize, the replacement child, the less than daughter. For the first time in my life, I was simply myself. Ellie Moore. Not Ellie the adopted daughter. Not Ellie the lesser sibling, just Ellie. I taught my classes during the day and spent my evenings writing. I explored the city on weekends and made friends who had no idea about my family drama. I started going to therapy with a French psychologist who helped me process the trauma of my childhood. Slowly I began to heal. Slowly I began to build a life that was entirely my own. I shared an excerpt from my writing online, just a small piece about what it felt like to grow up always being compared to a sibling. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people commented saying that I had told their story too. They shared their own experiences of favoritism and comparison and feeling less than. I realized that I wasn't alone in this experience. There were many people who had felt the same way. An editor at a small publishing house saw my online excerpt and reached out to me. She asked if I would be interested in turning my full writing into a memoir. She said she thought it was powerful and important and that she wanted to help me get it published. I couldn't believe it was real. After years of writing for myself, someone was saying that my story mattered. Someone was saying that other people needed to hear it. I spent the next several months completing my memoir. I called it The Stand-In Daughter, because that was what I had been my entire life. I wrote about being adopted, about learning the truth, about the impact it had on my identity and my relationships. I wrote about the pain of favoritism and the way it shapes a person. The publishing house offered me a book deal. They wanted to publish my memoir and help me share my story with the world. I signed the contract with shaking hands, hardly able to believe that this was happening. My story, the story that had torn my family apart and broken my heart, was going to be a book that other people could read. It was going to be real and permanent and honest. A few months before my book was published, I was invited to do an interview for a podcast about family relationships and trauma. The interviewer was kind and thoughtful, and she asked me difficult questions about my experience. At one point she asked me, "Did your family ever know how much they hurt you? Have you ever told them?" I thought about that question carefully before answering. Then I said, "They will soon. My book is coming out in a few weeks, and they're going to read about everything they did. They're going to see how their choices affected me. And yes, I think they'll finally understand how much they hurt me." The interviewer's eyes widened. She asked a follow-up question, but I deflected. I didn't want to say too much. But that night, the podcast was released, and the clip of me saying "they will soon" went viral on social media. People shared it and commented on it, speculating about what my book would reveal. My parents' friends began texting them, asking if they had heard the interview. The secret I had been keeping was starting to unravel. When my book was released 2 weeks later, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Readers flooded my inbox with messages saying that I had told their story. Parents and siblings reached out asking for advice on how to repair their broken relationships. Teachers used it in their classrooms to discuss family trauma and favoritism. Mental health professionals recommended it to their clients. News outlets started writing articles about the book. Some of them mentioned my family by name. People in my parents' community recognized the details and made connections. My parents' friends started treating them differently. My mother's book club discussed the book one evening, and I was told that several members confronted her about her behavior. My parents called my phone repeatedly. I didn't answer. They sent emails asking me to talk to them to give them a chance to explain. I didn't respond. They tried to reach me through Claire, asking her to convince me to speak with them. But I was done talking to them. I had said everything I needed to say, and I had said it in a way they couldn't ignore or deny. Claire came to see me in Paris unexpectedly. She showed up at my apartment one afternoon, and I almost didn't let her in. But she looked so broken, so sad that I couldn't turn her away. We sat in my living room and she told me about the fallout at home. "They're furious," she said. "The neighbors are talking. People are treating them differently. Mom cries all the time now. Dad won't even discuss the book. He just acts like it doesn't exist. I felt nothing. No sympathy, no guilt. No desire to comfort her. She had known the truth my entire life and said nothing. She was only upset now because the truth had made her uncomfortable. I responded quietly, I didn't ruin anything. I just stopped pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. I told the truth about what happened. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and asked, "Don't you care that they're suffering?" "Not really," I said. "They made their choices. Now they're dealing with the consequences." She left my apartment an hour later, and I haven't heard from her since. My parents released a public statement through their lawyer saying that my book was fictional exaggeration, and that I had misrepresented family events for personal gain. They claimed that they loved me very much, and that the adoption had always been presented as a beautiful gift. They said I was mentally unstable, and that my book was a product of my confusion about my identity. The statement made me angry in a way I hadn't been angry before. So I did something I had been saving for the right moment. I posted a photo on social media. It was a clear, close-up photo of the adoption papers. My name, the date, my parents' signatures. No caption needed. Within hours, the post had thousands of shares and comments. People pointed out that my parents had called me a liar while the evidence of their deception was now public. News outlets picked up the story. Mental health experts wrote articles about favoritism and adoption, and the importance of honesty in families. My story spread farther than I had ever imagined. My parents' public statement unraveled. People who had known them for years said they had always suspected something was wrong with how they treated me. Friends admitted that they had been uncomfortable with the way I was treated but had never said anything. The perfect image that my family had carefully constructed for decades crumbled almost overnight. My parents lost their standing in their community. My father resigned from his position on several boards because people questioned his judgment and his integrity. My mother stopped attending social functions because she couldn't face the people she had known for years. The illusion of the perfect family dissolved, and what was revealed underneath was ugly and painful. My father sent me one email. It contained only one line. "We should have told you." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. He had known all those years. He had known that I didn't know the truth, and he had let me suffer under the weight of believing I was somehow deficient. An apology couldn't undo that. An email couldn't fix what he had broken. I deleted the email without forwarding it to anyone or sharing it online. That much privacy I could still give him, even as he had given me none. My book hit the #1 position on the bestseller list. My publisher invited me to speak at a national conference about healing from emotional neglect and family trauma. I stood on a stage under bright lights, looking out at hundreds of people who had come to listen to my story. When I spoke about my childhood, about the moment I learned I was adopted, about the pain of being treated as less than, people cried. When I talked about my journey to self-acceptance and healing, they nodded with understanding. When I discussed the importance of honesty in families, they listened intently. For the first time in my life, I was being seen. Not as the consolation prize or the replacement child or the less-than daughter. I was being seen as a person with a powerful story, with important truths to tell, with wisdom earned through pain. I was being seen as worthy. After my speech, people lined up to talk to me. They thanked me for telling my story. They shared their own experiences of favoritism and family trauma. They told me that my book had helped them understand their own pain. I realized that my suffering had not been meaningless. My pain had a purpose. It had meaning beyond just my own healing. Months after my book's success, Claire visited me again in Paris. She looked older somehow, worn down by the weight of everything that had happened. She told me that my parents were selling the house where I had grown up. She said that my mother had been crying for weeks, that she had aged years in just a few months. I didn't feel happy about that information. I didn't feel sad either. I felt neutral, as if I was hearing about events in someone else's life. This was the life they had chosen for themselves. Claire handed me something. It was a letter from my grandmother that I had never seen before. It was tucked inside an old notebook that had belonged to me as a child. My grandmother had written, "Family isn't who you come from, it's who you grow with. Be careful about who you let into your heart, Eleanor. You deserve people who choose you every day." I took the letter and thanked Claire. I gave her a signed copy of my book. I told her, "Tell them I finally forgive them. But I won't come back." She left Paris that afternoon, and I knew I would probably never see her again. That was okay. I found my grandmother's letter written on the back of an old note I had written to myself when I was 12 years old. On one side was my grandmother's wisdom. On the other side was my childhood handwriting, words I had written years ago. "I am not a consolation prize. I am worthy. I have enough." I had written those words to myself before I even knew why I needed to. Part of me had always known that something was wrong, that I was being treated unfairly. Part of me had been trying to convince myself that I had value even when no one around me was showing me that. I cried when I read those words. I cried for the little girl who had to convince herself that she was worthy because the people who should have convinced her for free were too broken to do it. I cried for all the years of pain and confusion and feeling less than. But I also cried with relief because now I knew that little girl had been right. I was worthy. It was enough. I always have been. I closed the balcony door of my Paris apartment, looking out at the city lights reflecting off the river below. My phone buzzed. It was a call from my mother. I looked at the caller ID for a long moment, then I pressed ignore. I had nothing left to say to her. I had already said everything I needed to say, and I had said it to the whole world. I walked over to my desk and picked up a signed copy of The Stand-In Daughter that I had placed there as a reminder of my journey. I held the book in my hands and whispered words to the people I had left behind. Thank you for choosing her. Thank you for showing me that I had to choose myself. Thank you for teaching me what not to do, so I could figure out who I really am. I placed the book back on my desk and looked out at Paris, at my life, at the person I had become. I was no longer the consolation prize. I was no longer trying to earn love from people who couldn't give it. I was Ellie Moore, and I was finally home.